Hello everyone, welcome back to our channel. Tonight we are traveling back in time to one of the most mysterious and unsettling chapters in the history of crime. Imagine walking through the foggy streets of London in the late 19th century, gas lamps flickering dimly, horse carriages rattling across cobblestone roads, and narrow alleys filled with shadows. It was a time of transition, when the British Empire stood tall on the world stage. Yet hidden beneath its grandeur were communities struggling with poverty, despair, and danger. Our story begins in the year 1888, in the heart of London's East End, a place called Whitechapel. Whitechapel was infamous not for wealth or glory, but for its overcrowded tenements, crumbling housing, and the constant presence of crime. For many residents, survival was a daily battle. The working class filled the streets during the day, while at night, the area took on a very different face. Taverns and alleys became gathering spots for those seeking comfort from hardship, while others found themselves trapped in lives of desperation. It was in this fragile and volatile environment that one of history's most infamous crime stories began to unfold. When people think of London in the Victorian era, they might imagine elegance, royalty, and progress. Yet Whitechapel was the other side of the coin, a district often ignored by society, left to deal with its own harsh realities. Thousands of immigrants arrived seeking better lives, but instead they found themselves in one of the city's most dangerous quarters. Overcrowding, lack of proper sanitation, and unemployment created a breeding ground for despair. It was here, amid the fog and filth, that a shadow began to take shape, a figure whose name would echo through time and remain unsolved even after more than a century. But before we speak of that figure, let us linger for a moment in Whitechapel itself to understand the setting in which fear would soon take root. The streets were narrow and dim, with gas lamps casting long, trembling shadows. Police presence was limited, and even when they did patrol, the officers could barely keep up with the constant reports of theft, violence, and unrest. For many women, survival meant walking the streets at night, searching for enough money to pay for food or lodging. Poverty was merciless, and choices were few. To an outsider, Whitechapel might have seemed like a forgotten world, a place where human struggle was hidden away from the wealthier districts of London. Yet by 1888, the East End could no longer be ignored. Something was happening, something terrifying that would soon draw attention not just from the city, but from newspapers across the globe. That year, a series of shocking crimes shattered whatever fragile sense of normalcy Whitechapel had. These were not ordinary incidents of theft or drunken fights. They were darker, more chilling, and carried out with a method that suggested both cruelty and precision. The victims were women living on the margins of society, individuals already burdened with hardship. What happened to them shocked even the most hardened police officers of the time. Word spread quickly through the narrow lanes and busy taverns. Fear gripped the district. Mothers warned daughters not to walk alone. Men accompanied wives and sisters through the dimly lit streets. The entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Who could be behind such acts? Why here? And why now? The press was quick to seize on the story. Newspapers published bold headlines, stirring both panic and fascination. Whitechapel became a name whispered with dread, and reporters from all over London rushed to capture the unfolding mystery. Some accounts were exaggerated, others filled with speculation, but all shared one element: the idea that a terrifying presence was moving among the people, unseen, unpredictable, and unstoppable. For the police, the challenge was immense. The streets of Whitechapel were a maze, filled with alleys and passageways that could allow anyone to vanish within seconds. Witnesses were few, and those who did speak often contradicted one another. The investigation soon became one of the most intense efforts Scotland Yard had ever undertaken. And yet, The figure they were searching for always seemed to remain one step ahead. This was not just another crime in London's history. It became a legend in its own time, a tale of fear, mystery, and unanswered questions. The year 1888 would forever be marked by these events, and Whitechapel would never again be seen in the same light. And so, as we set the stage for the story that follows, we invite you to imagine yourself walking through those fog-laden streets of Victorian London. The air is cold, your breath hangs before you, and the sound of footsteps echoes faintly in the distance. Somewhere nearby, someone watches. Someone who would later be known by a name that still chills us today, Jack the Ripper. Stay with us as we unfold this mystery step by step. In this journey, we won't focus on sensationalism or graphic details, but rather on the history, the atmosphere, and the enduring question, who was Jack the Ripper, and why has his story remained unsolved for more than 100 years? The year was 1888, and London was a city of stark contrasts. On one hand, it was the beating heart of the British Empire, a place where wealth and progress dazzled visitors, with symbols of industrial power and colonial reach. On the other hand, hidden just beyond the grandeur of its palaces and the elegance of its theaters, there lay districts where the reality of daily life was far from glittering. Whitechapel, in the East End, was one such place. To step into Whitechapel was to enter a world where survival itself was the only goal. The streets were cramped, the air heavy with smoke and refuse, and the cries of hungry children echoed through the alleys. Overcrowding was severe, with multiple families crammed into single rooms, paying rent for spaces barely fit for living. These conditions created an environment where sickness spread quickly, and desperation was woven into the fabric of daily existence. For many, opportunities were limited. Men labored long hours at the docks, in factories, or as casual workers, earning barely enough to keep food on the table. Women often turned to cleaning, laundry, or sewing, but when those options failed, many had no choice but to sell companionship on the streets to survive. Life was unforgiving, and every evening brought new risks. In Whitechapel, crime was not an exception, it was the rule. The narrow alleys and dimly lit corners became perfect grounds for pickpockets, muggers, and gangs. Violence was common, fueled by poverty and alcohol. Taverns overflowed with those seeking escape from misery, and drunken quarrels often ended in bloodshed. Police presence, though visible, was stretched thin, and officers could do little more than patrol and respond after trouble had already occurred. Amid this climate of uncertainty, women bore the heaviest burdens. Many were widows or abandoned wives, left with children to feed and no steady source of income. For them, the streets of Whitechapel offered both danger and survival. A few pennies could mean a night's lodging at a doss house, a bed in a crowded dormitory that kept them from freezing in the open air. Without those coins, the alternatives were cruel, wandering the streets all night, exposed to both the elements and those who preyed on the vulnerable. This cycle of poverty, crime, and desperation created a fragile community. Neighbors knew each other's hardships, yet trust was scarce. Rumors spread quickly, and fear was always close at hand. The East End was notorious across London, mentioned in newspapers as a breeding ground for vice and immorality, often judged harshly by those who lived in comfort on the other side of the city. But for those who lived there, it was simply home, a place where they struggled, hoped, and endured, even as society turned its back on them. Whitechapel at night was a world of shadows. Gas lamps flickered, but did little to pierce the darkness, leaving entire streets cloaked in gloom. The cobblestones were slick with rain, and the air carried the smell of smoke mixed with refuse. Men in caps walked briskly to lodging houses, while women loitered at street corners, waiting for opportunities to earn enough to get through another day. To an outsider, it may have seemed like a place abandoned by hope, Yet for thousands, it was the only reality they knew. This environment shaped the perfect stage for something far darker to emerge. The sheer anonymity of the streets, the lack of reliable records, and the constant flow of strangers moving in and out made Whitechapel a place where someone could hide in plain sight. Among the noise, the shadows, and the desperation, a figure could move unnoticed, someone who would strike fear not only into the hearts of local residents, but into the entire city. By the summer of 1888, tension was already in the air. Poverty had worsened, unemployment was high, and the social divide between the rich and poor grew more glaring. Newspapers frequently published stories of crime in the East End, often sensationalized, painting Whitechapel as a den of lawlessness. The rest of London regarded the district with both fear and fascination, seeing it as both dangerous and exotic. Yet few could have predicted that this already troubled neighborhood was about to become infamous worldwide. The stage was set, and the backdrop was a community already stretched to its limits. Whitechapel was filled with people struggling to live one day at a time, unaware that their neighborhood would soon be forever remembered, not only for poverty and crime, but for a mystery that continues to haunt history. Out of the darkness, a name would soon emerge, whispered first in taverns and alleys, then shouted across newspaper headlines. It was here, in these narrow streets of 1888, that the story of Jack the Ripper was about to begin. The victims who would soon draw the world's attention were women who lived on the margins of society. In Whitechapel, many of them were mothers, widows, or women abandoned by circumstance, forced into a life of hardship. Opportunities for steady work were scarce, and desperation often left them with only one option: to sell companionship on the streets. This was not a matter of choice or indulgence, it was survival. A few coins could mean food for the night, or a bed in a crowded lodging house. Without those coins, they faced cold pavements, hunger, and danger at every turn. Society at large judged them harshly, branding them immoral, yet offering no real support. Respectable London preferred to look away, condemning them in words while ignoring the poverty that drove them there. In Whitechapel, they were simply part of the daily landscape, women whose lives were marked by hardship, their presence both common and invisible. It was among these women that the unknown figure chose his victims. He did not strike at the wealthy or powerful, nor even at ordinary shopkeepers or workers. His pattern revealed a chilling focus. He targeted those who were already vulnerable, those whose voices carried the least weight in society. In doing so, he ensured that his crimes would send fear into every corner of Whitechapel, because almost every resident knew someone who lived that kind of life. Each victim was a woman who had walked the streets at night seeking just enough money to survive until morning. They lived in lodging houses, moving from place to place, never secure. They were women who, despite hardship, often formed bonds of friendship with others in the same situation, sharing meals, sharing stories, and sharing the weight of daily struggle. And yet there were also women who became easy prey in the dimly lit alleys and hidden courtyards of the East End. The streets themselves were treacherous. Gas lamps cast pools of weak light, leaving entire sections of the city in shadows. An encounter with a stranger in these places could be ordinary, a man paying for company, or it could be the last time anyone saw them alive. It was this dangerous environment that allowed the unknown figure to blend in, to approach his victims without raising alarm. To the women, he would have seemed like countless others who passed through Whitechapel at night. Only later would his name become synonymous with terror. What makes this chapter of history so haunting is not only the crimes themselves, but also the tragic stories of the women who lost their lives. They were not merely faceless figures in an old mystery. They were individuals with hopes, sorrows, and resilience. Some had families who cared for them. Others had once been wives or daughters whose paths had turned toward hardship. In remembering them, one sees not just victims of a nameless figure, but victims of a society that left them vulnerable in the first place. The killer's choice of targets reveals something deeper about the social fabric of London in 1888. He preyed on women who were least protected, whose disappearances might not immediately draw the same urgency as those from wealthier districts. And yet, when the truth of his acts emerged, even the wider world could not look away. The brutality was so shocking, the pattern so deliberate, that newspapers across the city began to dedicate entire front pages to the story. Suddenly, women who had been ignored in life were thrust into the spotlight in death, their stories carried beyond Whitechapel to readers across the nation. This sudden attention was both a tragedy and a turning point. On one hand, it brought fear and stigma to the community, branding Whitechapel as a place of horror. On the other, it forced London society to confront the desperate realities of its poorest district's realities it had long tried to ignore. The fact that the killer struck again and again, choosing the same type of victim each time, turned his crimes into something larger than individual acts of violence. They became a symbol of vulnerability, a reminder that poverty itself could be deadly. For the women of Whitechapel, life after the first attacks changed dramatically. Many were terrified to walk the streets at night. Some banded together for safety, while others avoided work altogether, despite the risk of starvation. Fear clung to the community like the fog that rolled in from the Thames, and suspicion grew with every shadow. Each man passing through the alleys became a possible threat, each stranger a potential killer. And so the stage was set for a series of crimes that would both horrify and fascinate the world. The women of Whitechapel, already forgotten by the world and life, were now at the center of a mystery that still endures more than a century later. The choice of victims was not random. It was a deliberate focus on those society deemed least important. Yet through this dark chapter, their voices continue to echo, reminding us that behind every headline and every whispered legend, there were real lives lost, real women whose only crime was being vulnerable in the wrong place, at the wrong time. The first reports of violence in Whitechapel spread like a chilling whisper through the narrow streets. At first, some believed it was just another fight gone wrong, the kind that happened often in a place where alcohol flowed freely and tempers ran short. But soon it became clear these were not ordinary crimes. Something far darker was unfolding. Something that carried a signature too deliberate to be dismissed as chance. Each crime bore a sense of calculation that unsettled both the community and the authorities. These were not random outbursts or robberies gone astray. They carried with them a pattern, a method that spoke of control, of intent, and of a mind that was both precise and merciless. The violence was shocking, even to hardened officers who had seen countless crimes before. Experienced policemen, men who had dealt with the worst of London's underworld, admitted that what they found was unlike anything they had ever encountered. The streets of Whitechapel were already filled with hardship, but this new wave of violence seemed to pierce through the heart of the community. People spoke in hushed tones, afraid that even saying too much might somehow draw the shadow closer. Mothers held their daughters a little tighter, and groups of women began to avoid walking alone. The sense of fear grew heavier with each passing day, for the pattern was unmistakable. The attacks were not isolated incidents, but part of a grim sequence. The brutality of the crimes was not just in the physical act itself, but in what it represented. They were messages carved into the very soul of Whitechapel, reminders that someone out there moved, unseen, choosing victims with chilling ease. It was as though the killer wanted not only to harm individuals, but to terrify an entire community. The effect was immediate. The streets emptied earlier at night, and those who had no choice but to be outside walked with constant unease. As newspapers began to cover the events, the public's shock deepened. Headlines screamed of horrors in the East End, and journalists, eager to sell papers, described the crimes in ways that magnified the terror. The press coverage turned the murders into a sensation, a story that readers could not look away from. Fear was no longer confined to Whitechapel. It spread across London, reaching even the comfortable drawing rooms of the wealthy, where people who had never set foot in the East End now spoke anxiously of the monster said to roam its alleys. Yet beyond the sensationalism, there was something undeniably chilling. The sense that these acts were carried out with a cold, unhurried hand. The killer was not rushing, not striking in blind rage. He was deliberate, methodical, and seemed to vanish into the night without trace. This ability to strike so violently and then disappear left investigators baffled and the community paralyzed with dread. For the people of Whitechapel, the brutality also carried another cruel weight. It reinforced the stigma they already faced from the rest of London. To many outsiders, the East End was already viewed as a place of vice and danger. The murder seemed to confirm those prejudices, painting the district as a den of horror. Yet for the residents themselves, the violence was not some spectacle. It was a nightmare that walked their very streets, turning familiar corners into places of dread. The emotional toll was profound. People who had little to begin with now lost their sense of safety as well. Women who once found a fragile livelihood in the streets faced choices even more impossible: risk danger at night or face hunger in the morning. Men who tried to protect their families found themselves helpless against an unseen predator. And children, overhearing whispers of terror, grew up with fear in their earliest memories. What made the crimes resonate beyond the physical violence was the way they revealed the vulnerability of an entire community. Whitechapel was already fragile, already burdened with poverty and neglect. Now it bore the additional weight of a terror that seemed to strike at will. The brutality became symbolic, standing for something larger than any single act. It was as though the killer had torn away the thin veil that separated survival from despair, leaving the people exposed not only to danger, but also to the gaze of a city that suddenly saw them as a spectacle of horror. Even as investigators searched desperately for clues, the community knew that the real wound went deeper. It was not only about the lives lost, but about the sense of helplessness that followed. The killings showed just how vulnerable the forgotten people of London truly were. In a world where wealth and power could buy safety, the poor of Whitechapel were left with nothing but fear and the hope that somehow the shadow would pass them by. And yet it did not. The violence returned again and again, each time reminding the city that this was no fleeting nightmare. The brutality became the very mark of the unknown figure, the detail that ensured his name would never be forgotten. In the alleys of Whitechapel, terror had taken on a form, and though no one could yet put a face to it, everyone knew it was there, watching, waiting, and ready to strike again. As the shadow continued to move through Whitechapel, the true signature of these crimes became clear. Each act carried a mark, a disturbing consistency that revealed not only cruelty, but also intent. It was as if the unknown figure sought to leave behind messages, etched not in words, but in the way the crimes were carried out. To investigators, it was a pattern too deliberate to be dismissed as coincidence. To the community, it was a symbol of horror that grew sharper with each new discovery. What unsettled people most was not only that lives were taken, but the way in which it was done. These were not swift acts, nor accidents of rage. They bore signs of cold deliberation. It seemed as though the figure wanted his actions to be unmistakable, to leave behind a chilling reminder that Whitechapel was under his gaze. The streets became his canvas, and the fear of the people became his medium. For the women of Whitechapel, this realization was devastating. It meant that the crimes were not random, that someone was moving among them with a method and a purpose. Every detail seemed to speak of calculation, as though the killer was crafting a narrative of his own design. In the dimly lit alleys, he left behind not just silence, but a kind of cruel artistry that shocked even seasoned officers. To describe the scenes in precise detail was unnecessary. What mattered was the impression they left. The victims were not merely gone. They were marked in ways that ensured their deaths would be remembered, retold, and feared. This was the essence of the brutality. Not just the act itself, but the symbolism it carried. Each crime felt like a statement, a declaration that the killer wanted the world to watch, to whisper, to tremble. The press, quick to seize upon this aspect, turned the story into daily headlines. They hinted at the gruesome nature of the crimes, using words that stirred imagination while avoiding outright confession. For readers, it was enough. The mere suggestion of what had been done was sufficient to spread panic. The newspapers became amplifiers of fear, and the killer's shadow grew larger with every edition sold. In Whitechapel, people began to interpret the crimes almost like a code. Some saw in them the hand of a man with medical knowledge, someone skilled enough to act with precision. Others believed they revealed the twisted mind of an artist, creating scenes of cruelty meant to shock. And still others thought they were the marks of pure hatred, directed at women who represented society's neglect. Whatever the truth, the symbolism was undeniable. The figure was no longer seen as just a criminal. He had become something more, an icon of terror, a name whispered in dread. By leaving behind such unforgettable signs, he ensured that the victims would not fade into obscurity, but that their memory would be tied forever to his legend. This was perhaps the cruelest part of all. Their stories, their lives, were overshadowed by the shadow that took them. Even for the police, the symbolic nature of the crimes added layers of confusion. If these acts were meant as messages, what did they mean? Was the figure taunting them, proving his ability to strike without consequence? Was he sending a signal to the public, to society at large? Or was the symbolism only, in the eyes of those who looked upon it, a desperate attempt to make sense of madness? As the pattern repeated, fear deepened. Each crime was no longer seen as an isolated tragedy, but as a piece of a larger design. It was as if the unknown figure was writing a story in the dark, a story where every chapter ended with the same haunting refrain, "No one is safe." Whitechapel was caught not only in the grip of violence, but in the grip of a legend being written before their eyes. For the residents, life became an uneasy balance between routine and dread. The baker still opened his shop at dawn. The dock worker still went to his labor. The children still played in the alleys. Yet beneath these ordinary rhythms lay a constant question: who would be next? The signs left behind at each scene made it impossible to forget. Impossible to hope that the danger had passed. The tragedy of it all was that the victims, already invisible in life, became visible only in death. They were remembered less for who they were, and more for what had been done to them. Yet, in that cruel twist, their voices were carried beyond Whitechapel, forcing London and the world to see the harsh realities of lives once ignored. And so, the story grew. Each symbolic act, each cruel signature, ensured that the shadow walking through Whitechapel was no longer just a man, but a myth. He had become Jack the Ripper, not only because of what he did, but because of how he ensured it could never be forgotten. As fear spread through Whitechapel and the wider city, a new element entered the story words. In an age when newspapers were the heartbeat of public opinion, language could shape legends, and in this case, it did. One morning, A letter arrived at the Central News Agency in London, written in red ink and signed with a name that would echo through history. It seemed to come from the very hand of the shadow himself. The letter was bold, taunting, and filled with a chilling confidence. Whether it truly came from the killer or from someone seeking attention has been debated for more than a century. But its effect was undeniable. At the bottom of the page were 4 words that would change the way the world spoke of the crimes: Jack the Ripper. The press seized upon the name instantly. It was short, sharp, and unforgettable. In an era when sensational headlines sold papers by the thousands, this name was irresistible. Soon, it appeared across front pages, shouted from newsboys on street corners. Another Ripper murder. Jack the Ripper strikes. Again, the name became the identity of the shadow who haunted Whitechapel, and it spread like wildfire. For the residents of the East End, the nickname gave form to their fear. Before, it had been an unnamed terror, a faceless figure who struck without warning. Now, it had a title, a brand of horror that could be whispered in alleyways and taverns alike. The name seemed to give the figure even greater power, as though speaking it invited his presence into the room. For the wider public, far removed from the alleys of Whitechapel, Jack the Ripper was a story they could follow in the comfort of their homes. The newspapers turned each crime into serialized drama, complete with theories, alleged sightings, and editorials. Readers across Britain and beyond devoured the stories, caught between fascination and dread. The figure became not only a local criminal, but a national obsession. The power of the name lay in its ambiguity. Jack was common, an everyman's name, making the figure feel at once ordinary and unknowable. The Ripper was brutal, unforgettable, and hinted at the violence without ever needing to describe it in detail. Together, the words created a persona larger than life, someone who could walk unseen, strike without warning, and vanish like a ghost. Whether the letter that introduced the name was genuine or a hoax remains one of the enduring mysteries of the case. Some believe it was penned by a journalist seeking to inflame the story and sell more papers. Others argue that the details within suggest knowledge only the killer could have had. Either way, by the time doubt entered the discussion, it no longer mattered. The name had stuck, and the shadow of Whitechapel now had an identity the world would never forget. The police, for their part, were uneasy about the nickname. They feared it glamorized the killer, giving him notoriety and feeding into the very terror they were trying to quell. Yet there was little they could do. The press had found a term that captured attention, and they would not let it go. Every headline printed with Jack the Ripper sold papers. And in the world of 1888 journalism, sales were everything. For the community, the nickname cut both ways. On one hand, it gave them a way to talk about the fear that stalked their streets, a shared term for the nightmare they endured. On the other hand, it brought unwanted attention. Whitechapel was no longer just a poor district. It was now Ripper territory, a place outsiders viewed with both horror and curiosity. Crowds of people even began to visit the area, hoping to glimpse the alleys where the infamous figure walked, turning tragedy into a macabre form of tourism. The emergence of Jack the Ripper marked a turning point in criminal history. Never before had a killer been so closely linked with a name that carried its own mythology. The press had created more than just a headline. They had birthed a legend. From that moment on, every whisper, every rumor, every fearful glance down a dark alley was tied to that name. Over time, the nickname outgrew the crimes themselves. Even as the murders faded into the past, Jack the Ripper remained a figure of fascination, a puzzle that generations would attempt to solve. The name became a cultural symbol, appearing in books, plays, and later films, always carrying with it the sense of dread first felt in 1888. In this way, the figure achieved a kind of immortality. Whether he intended it or not, the combination of mystery, brutality, and the unforgettable nickname ensured that his story would never truly fade. The legend of Jack the Ripper was not only written in the streets of Whitechapel, but also etched into the collective imagination of the world. The legend of Jack the Ripper was not born only from the crimes themselves, but from words that appeared on paper. In late September of 1888, as fear gripped Whitechapel and newspapers competed for headlines, a letter arrived at the Central News Agency in London. It was neatly addressed, written in red ink, and carried a tone that was both mocking and chilling. The letter began with two words that instantly demanded attention. "Dear Boss." It read as though the writer were speaking directly to the world, taunting the authorities, mocking their failures, and promising more to come. Most disturbingly, it was signed not with an ordinary name, but with one that seemed deliberately chosen to shock: Jack the Ripper. In an age when newspapers were the lifeline of public information, the letter was irresistible. Editors recognized at once the power of its contents. Whether the writer was truly the man behind the Whitechapel murders, or simply an imposter seeking notoriety, the effect would be the same. Readers would be captivated, and fear would spread even further. The decision was made to publish the letter, and soon it appeared in print. For the public, already on edge, the letter added a new layer of dread. Until then, the killer had been faceless, nameless, a shadow. Now, he had not only a name but a voice. The words on the page felt intimate, as if the killer himself were speaking directly to every reader, boasting of his power and laughing at the police. The authenticity of the Dear Boss letter has been debated ever since. Some historians argue that it contained details that only the killer could have known, suggesting it was genuine. Others believe it was a clever hoax, perhaps written by a journalist eager to feed the growing frenzy and sell more newspapers. At the time, however, those distinctions mattered little. The effect of the letter was immediate and profound. Scotland Yard, already struggling to calm the public, found itself overwhelmed by the uproar the letter caused. Now, not only were they chasing a murderer, they were chasing a personality, an identity that had been branded in ink. The figure who had once been nameless was now Jack the Ripper, and his story had taken on a life beyond the crimes themselves. The public devoured every word. People read the letter aloud in pubs, whispered about it in factories, and passed copies among friends. The killer had become a storyteller of his own legend, and the city was his audience. To many, the tone of the letter was what struck deepest. It was not desperate or apologetic. It was playful, taunting, and written with a cruel sense of humor. It seemed to say, "I am out there, I am watching, and you cannot stop me." The police tried to use the letter as a clue. They studied the handwriting, the style, the ink. They compared it with other correspondence. Soon, more letters followed, some equally taunting, others bizarre. Each one was carefully examined, but the flood of communications only added confusion. Were they all from the same hand? Were they hoaxes written by copycats? Or was the true killer hiding among them, using the press as his stage? Among the many letters received, the Dear Boss note stood out as the most infamous. It was the one that gave the killer his name, the one that transformed a series of local murders into an international legend. Even if it had been a hoax, its impact was real. It shaped the way people thought of the crimes and gave the shadow of Whitechapel a persona that would endure for centuries. For the residents of Whitechapel, the letter made the nightmare worse. It suggested that the figure was not only among them, but also enjoying their fear. To imagine the killer writing, laughing, and mocking was more disturbing than the crimes alone. It made him seem not only dangerous but untouchable. someone who could walk past the very officers searching for him and vanish into the crowd with ease. In time, investigators would admit that publishing the letter may have been a mistake. It gave the killer, or whoever had written it, exactly what they wanted: attention, notoriety, and a platform to spread terror. Yet by then, it was too late. The name had already spread, and the legend had already grown. The Dear Boss letter remains one of the most studied pieces of correspondence in criminal history. It is a reminder of how words can shape fear, how ink on paper can give birth to legends as enduring as any act of violence. Genuine or not, it succeeded. In one undeniable way, it ensured that Jack the Ripper would never be forgotten. London in 1888 was no stranger to crime, but nothing in its long history had prepared the city for the wave of fear that now spread from Whitechapel to every corner of the capital. As the headlines grew larger and the stories more sensational, the name Jack the Ripper became impossible to ignore. What had begun as whispered rumors in East End taverns was now a subject of conversation in drawing rooms, marketplaces, and Parliament itself. The city, vast and powerful, found itself held hostage by an unseen figure. The panic did not stay confined to Whitechapel. Though the crimes occurred within the narrow lanes of the East End, the sense of danger rippled outward like waves in water. Residents in wealthier districts, far removed from the alleys of Whitechapel, began to look over their shoulders at night. The notion that a killer could move unseen through London's fog struck at the very heart of the city's confidence. If the police could not protect people in Whitechapel, who could say they would be safe anywhere else? Crowds began to gather at crime scenes, drawn by morbid curiosity and fear. Some came hoping for answers, others for spectacle, but all left with a deeper sense of unease. The press fed the frenzy, publishing not only reports of the crimes, but also speculative editorials, imagined details, and even illustrations that blurred the line between fact and sensationalism. Each new article seemed to inflame the panic rather than calm it. For women in Whitechapel, fear became a constant companion. Many refused to go out alone at night, and some banded together in groups, walking arm in arm beneath the dim glow of gas lamps. Lodging housekeepers locked doors earlier, warning tenants not to linger in the streets. Even those who had once been hardened to the dangers of East End nights admitted that this new terror felt different, colder, more calculating, more unstoppable. Men, too, felt the weight of suspicion. Neighbors eyed one another with mistrust. Strangers passing through the district were questioned, sometimes even threatened by angry crowds who believed the killer might be among them. The sense of paranoia grew so intense that ordinary quarrels could escalate into accusations of being the Ripper. The figure had become not just a man, but a ghostly presence that seemed to haunt every alley, every shadow, every unfamiliar face. The police, already stretched thin, now faced a crisis unlike any before. Scotland Yard assigned additional officers to the case, and constables were dispatched to patrol Whitechapel's maze of streets. Night after night, policemen walked in pairs or small groups, lanterns in hand, hoping to deter the killer or catch him in the act. Yet despite their efforts, the crimes continued, and with each new headline, criticism mounted. The press accused the police of incompetence, the public accused them of negligence, and officials feared that their inability to stop the terror would undermine trust in the entire system of law and order. The atmosphere of fear even reached into politics. Questions were raised in Parliament about the conditions in the East End, about poverty, crime, and the failures of the police. For the first time, the plight of Whitechapel's poor, long ignored by society, was thrust into the national spotlight, not out of compassion, but out of alarm. The murders had forced London's leaders to confront the stark divide between its wealthy West End and its suffering East. Meanwhile, the name Jack the Ripper grew larger with every passing week. Children whispered it in schoolyards, workers muttered it on factory floors, and theater productions rushed to weave the terror into plays and songs. The figure became not only a criminal but a cultural phenomenon, and with every retelling, the sense of fear deepened, as though the shadow was no longer confined to Whitechapel, but had slipped into the imagination of the entire city. What made the panic so powerful was the killer's invisibility. If he had been caught, the fear might have ended quickly, replaced by outrage or grief. But his ability to strike and vanish created a kind of terror that was harder to fight an enemy without a face. Londoners lived in a state of suspended dread, knowing the figure could be anywhere and that the next morning's papers might bring news of another attack. By the autumn of 1888, the panic had reached its peak. Ordinary life continued, shops opened, factories ran, children played, but beneath it all lay a tension that could not be ignored. Whitechapel, already burdened by poverty, now carried the weight of fear for an entire city. The people were not only struggling to survive the hardships of daily life, they were living in the shadow of a name that had come to symbolize something much darker than crime itself. And so, the legend of Jack the Ripper grew. It was not only his actions, but the fear and panic they inspired that ensured his place in history. London, proud and powerful, had been shaken to its core, and the echoes of that panic would continue long after the gas lamps of 1888 had burned out. As the panic deepened, all eyes turned to the police. Scotland Yard, the very symbol of law and order in Britain, found itself at the center of a storm. The public demanded answers, the newspapers demanded progress, and the people of Whitechapel demanded safety. Never before had the Yard faced such intense scrutiny, and never before had its reputation been so tested. From the earliest crimes, investigators realized they were dealing with something far beyond ordinary street violence. Special detectives were assigned to the case, including Inspector Frederick Aberline, who would later become one of the most recognized names associated with the investigation. Aberline and his colleagues walked the streets of Whitechapel night after night, speaking with residents, questioning suspects, and searching for even the smallest clue. Their presence became a familiar sight in the East End, lanterns in hand, trying to bring light to a mystery cloaked in shadows. The police employed every method available to them at the time. They interviewed witnesses, tracked movements, and scoured lodging houses where the victims were known to stay. Informants were paid for tips, and undercover officers were deployed in hopes of catching the killer in the act. Leaflets were distributed, warning women to be cautious, and constables patrolled the streets in greater numbers than ever before. By some accounts, as many as 80 officers were working the case at its height, an enormous effort for the late 19th century. Despite these efforts, the killer seemed always to remain one step ahead. The narrow alleys of Whitechapel offered countless escape routes, and the darkness made pursuit nearly impossible. Witness statements were often contradictory. One person claimed to see a tall man in a hat. Another swore it was a short man with a beard. The confusion only added to the frustration of the detectives. Every time a new crime occurred, the pressure grew heavier. Newspapers accused the police of incompetence, publishing scathing editorials that mocked their failures. Headlines like, "Is Scotland Yard helpless?" and "The Ripper laughs at the police" appeared regularly, stinging the very officers who worked day and night without rest. The more the press ridiculed them, the more the public demanded results. Scotland Yard was trapped in a battle not only against an unknown killer, but also against the court of public opinion. The case file grew thicker by the week. Names of suspects filled its pages: local butchers, medical students, immigrants, even aristocrats. Some were arrested and questioned, others were followed for days. Yet each lead eventually collapsed under the weight of uncertainty. Forensic science was still in its infancy, and without fingerprints, DNA, or modern techniques. The detectives were left with little more than observation and instinct. The trail went cold as quickly as it was found. Inspector Aberline, respected for his skill and experience, was said to have worked tirelessly, but even he could not break through the mystery. Years later, he admitted that despite all the effort, the investigation had led nowhere. For every suspect they examined, there was always a lack of solid evidence. The killer was like smoke, visible for a moment, then vanishing into the night. The strain on the police force was immense. Constables patrolling Whitechapel reported harassment from angry crowds who accused them of doing nothing. Some officers even became the targets of suspicion themselves, with rumors spreading that the Ripper might be hiding among the very men meant to catch him. Trust between the community and the police, already fragile, began to fray. Yet it would be unfair to say the police did nothing. By the standards of the time, they pursued the case with remarkable dedication. They kept detailed records, mapped out crime scenes, and cross-checked witness testimonies. Their work laid the foundation for what modern detectives would later recognize as the beginnings of organized criminal investigation. But the truth was simple. The tools available in 1888 were not enough to solve a case like this. As weeks turned into months, frustration gave way to resignation. The crime slowed and eventually stopped, but no arrest was ever made. Scotland Yard, for all its effort, had failed to deliver what the public most desired, the face of the man behind the terror. The failure haunted the force for decades, a blemish on its history that no amount of dedication could erase. For the people of London, the lack of resolution was perhaps the most terrifying outcome of all. A killer had walked their streets, taken lives in the most chilling manner, and then disappeared into history, leaving only questions behind. The idea that someone could commit such acts and escape the grasp of the law shook public confidence in ways that would echo for generations. In the end, Scotland Yard's investigation became not only a story of pursuit, but also a story of limits. The limits of 19th century policing, the limits of human endurance, and the limits of society's ability to comprehend a figure who seemed to defy explanation. The detectives did not find Jack the Ripper, and perhaps that was why his legend endured. Mystery, after all, thrives where certainty is absent. As Scotland Yard struggled to make progress, the mystery of Jack the Ripper opened the door to endless speculation. With no conclusive evidence and no arrest, suspicion spread like wildfire. Every man who lived in Whitechapel, every stranger seen in the wrong place at the wrong time, could suddenly become a suspect. The lack of resolution allowed the imagination of the public and the press to run free. Soon, dozens of names filled the case files, ranging from the ordinary to the extraordinary. One of the earliest theories pointed toward men with medical knowledge. The precision and apparent confidence with which the crimes were carried out led some investigators to believe the killer must have been a doctor, a surgeon, or at least someone trained in anatomy. Rumors spread that the Ripper might be a failed medical student, or even a butcher who handled knives daily. These theories gained traction not only because they seemed logical, but because they added a chilling dimension. The idea that someone educated and respected could hide behind a mask of civility while committing unspeakable acts at night. Among the more famous suspects was Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher. When he was found dead in the Thames shortly after the last of the canonical murders, some investigators linked his demise to the end of the killings. His background, respectable yet troubled, made him an intriguing candidate in the eyes of later writers. However, no concrete evidence ever tied him to the crimes, and his name remains one of many in the long list of possibilities. Another figure who drew attention was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant living in the East End. He was known to struggle with mental health issues, and his presence in Whitechapel during these murders placed him under suspicion. Years later, his name would resurface as DNA testing of old evidence suggested a possible connection. Yet even then, debate raged about the reliability of the findings. Theories also ventured into the upper classes. Some suggested that the Ripper might have been a member of the aristocracy, a man with wealth and influence who could easily avoid suspicion. One enduring theory pointed toward Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, grandson of Queen Victoria. While historians generally dismiss this idea as sensational fiction, it captured the imagination of conspiracy theorists who believed the murders were part of a cover-up to protect the royal family's reputation. Artists, too, found themselves accused. Walter Sickert, a well-known painter of the era, was later named by author Patricia Cornwell as a possible suspect based on interpretations of his artwork and alleged connections to the crimes. Though many historians dispute this claim, it shows how the Ripper mystery continued to inspire speculation long after the murders themselves ended. The police files also contain names of ordinary men, laborers, sailors, and local residents who happened to match vague descriptions or who were arrested for suspicious behavior. One man might have been seen with blood on his clothes, another might have offered inconsistent answers when questioned, and still another might simply have lived too close to the crime scenes. For weeks, arrests were made, interrogations conducted, and suspects released. None led to a breakthrough. As time passed, the number of suspects only grew. Journalists, historians, and amateur detectives each added their own theories. Some claimed the killer was a local barber. Others believed it was a traveling foreigner, and still others suggested it was more than one person working together. The lack of certainty meant that almost any theory could find an audience. What is striking is how the identity of Jack the Ripper became less about evidence and more about narrative. Each suspect represented a different story, a different way of interpreting the terror. If the killer were a doctor, it was a tale of corrupted knowledge. If a royal, it was a story of hidden scandal. If an immigrant, it reflected the social tensions of the time. If an artist, it became a tale of madness hidden in creativity. The Ripper was less a single man than a mirror, reflecting the fears and prejudices of Victorian society. The fascination with suspects continues to this day. Modern books and documentaries regularly revisit the case, each offering new proof of a favorite theory. Yet none have provided the conclusive answer that investigators of 1888 so desperately sought. The truth remains elusive. And perhaps that is part of the reason the story endures. The mystery of Jack the Ripper lies not only in what was done, but in who might have done it, and the fact that after more than a century, the world is still asking the same question. In the end, the long list of suspects tells us as much about the people searching for answers as it does about the crimes themselves. Each theory reveals the fears, biases, and imagination of its time. Whether the Ripper was a doctor, a nobleman, an artist, or an ordinary man lost in the shadows, his identity remains hidden. And with every passing year, the mystery only deepens, ensuring that the search for the Ripper will never truly end. More than a century has passed since the foggy nights of 1888, and yet the shadow of Jack the Ripper has never fully faded. Historians, detectives, journalists, and amateur sleuths have all taken their turn at solving the case. Each generation brings new theories, new tools, and new promises of resolution. And yet, despite all of this, the central truth remains the same. No one knows for certain who Jack the Ripper really was. In the early decades after the crimes, the investigation was limited by the science of its time. Fingerprinting was not yet in use, and forensic methods were primitive compared to today. As the years turned into decades, hope of solving the case seemed to drift further away. Evidence was mishandled, some records were lost, and memories of witnesses faded. What was once a living investigation slowly transformed into a historical puzzle. The 20th century saw renewed efforts to uncover the truth. Police files were studied, suspects re-examined, and theories published in countless books. Each author seemed convinced they had discovered the missing piece, pointing to one suspect or another with confidence. Yet for every bold claim, critics responded with doubt, finding holes in the evidence and weaknesses in the reasoning. The case became less about solving a crime and more about fueling endless debate. With the rise of modern science, there was hope that technology might succeed where Victorian detectives had failed. Forensic experts examined what little physical evidence remained: letters allegedly written by the killer, scraps of clothing, and crime scene notes preserved in archives. One of the most famous examples was the testing of a shawl said to have belonged to one of the victims. In 2014, researchers announced that DNA traces on the fabric pointed toward Aaron Kosminski, the Polish barber long suspected by some investigators. But the excitement was quickly tempered by skepticism. Other scientists questioned the reliability of the results, noting that the DNA samples were small and possibly contaminated over the decades. The shawl's connection to the crime itself was also uncertain, leaving open the possibility that the evidence was flawed from the beginning. What had seemed like a breakthrough soon dissolved back into the familiar fog of uncertainty. Other modern studies focused on handwriting analysis of the Dear Boss letter, geographic profiling of the crime scenes, and psychological profiling of the killer's behavior. Each method provided fascinating insights, painting a picture of the kind of person Jack the Ripper might have been. Some argued he was likely a local resident familiar with the streets. Others suggested he could have been a traveler, moving in and out of Whitechapel unnoticed. Yet these insights, while intriguing, offered no definitive proof. They only deepened the sense of mystery. The greatest challenge in solving the case today is the lack of reliable evidence. Over time, physical items have been lost, destroyed, or degraded. Witness testimonies, already inconsistent in 1888, cannot be re-examined. Even the police files themselves are incomplete, leaving gaps that modern investigators can never fill. The Ripper case is a reminder that no matter how advanced our tools become, they cannot create certainty where the past has left only fragments. Still, the fascination endures. Television documentaries and research projects continue to revisit the case, each offering a new angle or theory. Some suggest the killer may never have been caught because he left London after the murders. Others argue he may have died shortly after, his identity lost in time. A few even claim that the mystery remains unsolved because it was never meant to be solved, that the truth was buried deliberately to protect someone powerful. Yet at the heart of all these theories lies one simple fact: the identity of Jack the Ripper is unknown. Despite centuries of speculation and the best efforts of modern science, the figure remains hidden behind the veil of history. That uncertainty is perhaps the very reason the story has endured for so long. A solved case becomes a closed chapter. An unsolved case becomes a legend. Jack the Ripper has become less a person than a symbol. He represents the limits of justice, the failures of institutions, and the darkness that can hide in plain sight. His story is a reminder of how fear can shape a city, how mystery can outlast fact, and how some questions may never be answered. And so, after more than 130 years, London still carries the memory of the autumn of 1888. The foggy streets of Whitechapel may have changed, but the legend of the Ripper lingers. He is a ghost not only of the past, but of our imagination, a mystery that resists resolution no matter how hard we try. The truth remains out of reach, and perhaps that is why we still tell his story today. Though Jack the Ripper's true identity was never uncovered, his presence has endured far beyond the foggy nights of Whitechapel. Over the decades, the case transformed from an unsolved crime into something much larger, a cultural legend. The very name, once printed in bold headlines to shock and terrify, has become a symbol recognized around the world. It is a story that has transcended history, weaving itself into literature, film, art, and even the collective imagination of society. Almost immediately after the murders ended, writers and journalists began to shape the events into narratives. Penny Dreadful's cheap publications, popular in Victorian England, seized on the mystery, spinning tales of the shadowy figure who had evaded justice. These early stories exaggerated details, blending fact with fiction, but they ensured that the Ripper lived on in the public mind even after the newspapers moved on. As time passed, the Ripper became a subject not only for popular entertainment, but also for serious study. Historians, criminologists, and psychologists all attempted to unravel the mystery, publishing volumes of research and analysis. Each new book added another layer, turning the Ripper from a single case into a field of study all its own. Today, Ripperology is an entire discipline, with conferences, journals, and debates devoted to the subject. Few other unsolved crimes have inspired such lasting academic interest. The cultural impact expanded even further with the rise of cinema. Jack the Ripper appeared on the silent screen as early as the 1920s, portrayed as a menacing figure stalking the streets of London. Later films gave him many faces, sometimes a mad doctor, sometimes a member of the aristocracy, sometimes a supernatural phantom. Each interpretation reflected the fears of its time, proving how adaptable the legend was. Audiences were drawn not only to the mystery, but also to the atmosphere of fog, gas lamps, and suspense that the Ripper's story provided. Television, too, embraced the legend. Documentaries, dramas, and even fictionalized detective series returned again and again to the case, each promising new insights or dramatic retellings. For modern viewers, Jack the Ripper became less about who he truly was and more about what he represented. The ultimate unsolved mystery, a puzzle without a solution. The story fit perfectly into the growing fascination with true crime, making him one of the earliest and most enduring figures in that genre. Literature has also played a powerful role in shaping the Ripper's cultural legacy. Writers such as Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, were contemporaries of the events, and some later adaptations even imagined Holmes himself facing off against the infamous killer. Novels, short stories, and plays have continued this trend, often using the Ripper as a backdrop for tales of mystery, horror, or social commentary. In these works, the Ripper is not merely a figure from history, but a symbol of society's darkest fears. The legend has even influenced music, art, and theater. Songs have been written, paintings created, and stage productions performed, all inspired by the haunting imagery of foggy London streets and the nameless figure who moved among them. Jack the Ripper has become less of a person and more of an archetype, the faceless villain who embodies mystery itself. What is striking is how the Ripper's story continues to evolve with time. In the Victorian era, he was a symbol of urban fear, a reminder of the dangers lurking in neglected corners of the city. In the 20th century, he became a figure of fascination for those exploring psychology and criminology. In today's world, he stands as a global icon of true crime storytelling, discussed not only in scholarly debates but also in podcasts, YouTube videos, and online forums. The enduring popularity of the case also reflects something deeper: humanity's fascination with the unknown. Mysteries hold a special place in our imagination, and the Ripper case is one of the most enduring of them all, because the killer was never caught. The story remains open, inviting speculation, theories, and retellings. Every generation finds in it something new, whether it is fear, curiosity, or a mirror of its own social anxieties. Yet, in remembering the legend, it is important not to forget the reality behind it. At the heart of the story are the women whose lives were cut short, women who lived in hardship and whose struggles reflected the inequalities of their time. While the world has turned their tragedy into myth, their voices remind us that the Ripper's story was not just about terror, but also about the human cost of poverty and neglect. And so, more than 130 years after the autumn of 1888, the story of Jack the Ripper remains alive. It lingers not because of the man himself whose identity is forever lost to history, but because of the legend that grew in his shadow. Films, books, plays, and countless retellings have ensured that he will never truly fade. He is less a figure of the past than a ghost of our collective imagination, a reminder of how mystery can outlast certainty, and how stories can grow larger than the facts that created them. In the end, Jack the Ripper is not only a case file in Scotland Yard's archives. He is a cultural icon, a symbol of the unknown, and a story that continues to fascinate the world. His name, born in ink on a letter more than a century ago, remains one of the most chilling and unforgettable in history. And so our journey through the fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel comes to an end. We have walked through the alleys of 1888, witnessed how fear gripped an entire city, and explored how one nameless figure left behind not only unanswered questions, but also a legend that continues to echo through time. Jack the Ripper was never caught, his identity never revealed, and perhaps that very absence of resolution is what keeps his story alive. He became not just a man, but a mystery, a symbol of fear, of fascination, and of the unknown that lingers in the shadows of history. What began as a series of crimes in one of London's poorest districts transformed into a cultural phenomenon that has outlived generations. We saw how the press gave him a name, how society filled the gaps with theories, and how modern science still cannot close the case. In the end, Jack the Ripper remains less about the man himself and more about the questions he left behind. His legend reminds us of the fragility of safety, the power of mystery, and the enduring human drive to seek answers, even when the truth lies just beyond our reach. As we close this story, let us not forget the real lives at its center, the women of Whitechapel, whose struggles and tragedies have too often been overshadowed by the myth. Their memory gives depth to the history, reminding us that behind the legend was a community that suffered, endured, and continued on despite the fear that walked its streets. Thank you for staying with us through this journey into one of history's greatest mysteries. If you enjoyed this exploration and want to hear more stories that blend history, mystery, and reflection, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these stories to life, keeping history's echoes alive for new generations. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and remember, some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but to be remembered